My name is Sonja Gajić. I'm director of Belgrade Center for Security Policy that is co-organizing this event together with the European Movement in Serbia and Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence. Welcome to the academic part of the Belgrade Security Forum, which is a unique feature of a policy forums like this that we are proud of because since the beginning we wanted to facilitate dialogue between those whose job is to think and ask questions and those whose job is to implement policies and deal with the challenges of changing environment. So policy and academia meet within the Belgrade Security Forum this year to discuss a highly topical issue on the readiness of EU to deal with the crisis management. And it is possible because of a partnership within the EU-CIVCAP project that is funded by EU and Horizon 2020 academic program, and it gathers 12 institutes from all over Europe, but also Somalia, to do research on EU capacities to prevent conflicts and to do peace building, but also to highlight shortcomings in EU approaches. And I think it feels really close. This topic feels close to home, since we have been a recipient as Serbia and the region of EU crisis management, and much of the research that is going to be presented today is dealing with the case studies of EU work in Kosovo, Bosnia, but also in other neighborhood regions. I'm proud to announce that every year we have more and more applications for this part of the dialogue, and this year we had 60 applications of people from universities and institutes throughout Europe that wanted to discuss this current affair. And as one journalist asked me the other day, is EU ready to do crisis management on its borders when it's facing crisis at home? I hope that we will address this issue through a dialogue of both those from countries that export crisis management, but also from countries represented here that were kind of recipients of EU crisis management. What I also wanted to highlight is a novelty, and this is that this year we are happy to have not only academics and researchers presenting their work and moderating the discussion, but we really have practitioners that are going to be discussants of the academic papers. So our ambition to facilitate academic and policy dialogue will take place. We will have practitioners who have experiences in managing EU crisis response, but also from a Serbian government working with the EU on a common foreign and security policy. Without further ado, I would like to present our keynote speaker, Professor Michael E. Smith from the University of Aberdeen. That is, for those that might not be familiar, always in textbooks on EU common foreign and security policy, one of the key authors in the field of European security, international relations, and institutions. And for me, it was interesting to research his biography beyond what is published in our brochure, and to find that besides getting awards for the best articles in the journals, he also got more than once awards for the best teacher at the different universities he was teaching, which is, I think, a hopeful sign that you can be a good academic and still keep a good communication with the future generations that you are nurturing. Also, what I wanted to say that Professor Smith is involved within the EU-CIVCAP project on reading all of our works and much of the work that you are going to hear today, and drawing lessons learned, so that we are not to wait for academic process to be finished in order to share the lessons with those that are implementing the policies that we are analyzing. So I would invite Professor Smith to give a keynote lecture or presentation on European security and crisis management since 2003, since the time the first European security strategy was adopted, and is the CSDP fit for the purpose? As I've said in the introduction, there are a lot of questions on not just capability, but the unity and cohesiveness of EU policy in a current environment, but hopefully we'll get some of the best practices too today during the discussion. So I call Professor Smith to take my place.
Okay, good morning. I have some slides here. As an academic, I'm legally required, I think, to use PowerPoint. So let me just get this started, and we can talk a little bit about the performance of European security policy, if this will work for me. Okay, you're supposed to be seeing slides up there, but I can see them. So if we can get that working. So basically this is, here we go, a research project looking backwards rather than more forwards, talking about how well the system has functioned over the past 15 or 16 years. And it basically asks 3 questions to help structure this presentation. The first has to go back in time and talk about why the CSDP was actually created in the first place. And then the second looks at how the CSDP has functioned since 2003, since the first CSDP operations were instigated. And then the third brings us to the current situation today in terms of the EU's ambitions and security problems. And all these findings can be found in a very useful book form if you're interested. So this book just came out this year, so this summarizes most of what I'm going to be talking about today. And it makes a great Christmas gift as well, so please take a look at this, hardback and paperback, and ebook, of course. So the book covers the creation of the CSDP, late 1990s, all the way up to operations through roughly mid-2016. And the central argument is pretty simple. It's that the CSDP, most of what it does is oriented towards capacity building and what I call experiential learning in the realm of security, rather than actually securing the EU itself, although there is some overlap between those activities. So looking back at the purpose, why do we actually have this mechanism? The first thing to get out of the way is that there is no D in CSDP currently. No real defense policy within the mechanism, so that's something we probably all, I think, can agree upon for the most part. There's defense cooperation and networks and so forth, but an actual defense policy in the sense of what you would get through, say, NATO, does not really exist within the mechanism. And so the CSDP inherited the main functions of the Western European Union, but has not built upon them really at all over the past 20 years. So a huge missed opportunity here. So you can see on the bottom, the Western European Union has existed through most of the European Union's history. And you can see a huge amount of dynamism in other elements of the European Union related to the single market, enlargement, and especially internal security. So internal European security compared to external European security is extremely creative and dynamic and effective. The Western European Union in terms of defense, not so much. So a huge missed opportunity here. So they basically grafted on the WEU institutions and functions, such as they were, into the CSDP as a starting point, but it hasn't moved very far past that initial change. At the same time, as we know, NATO itself has reinvigorated itself over the past 10 or 20 years. Remember, at the time the CSDP was created, people expected and even hoped for some states that NATO would actually disappear, or its functions would be relegated to other actors or so forth. So the point is that while Western European Union and CSDP have remained static institutions in the realm of defense, NATO has grown, has expanded, and has been doing a lot more in this realm to overshadow what the D is in CSDP. And again, a big elephant in the room, of course, with defense policy in Europe is the role of nuclear weapons. And this is very much a no-go area within European Union politics. There's been some talk lately, as you may know, about a Euro deterrent, that France possibly could provide some type of European deterrent, nuclear deterrent, to take place of say, the United States, or if the UK leaves the EU, which is likely. But again, this is mainly talk, and I don't see any prospects for this happening anytime soon. So again, to conclude the defense side of this, which again is very lacking, CSDP currently can function very well as a backup to what NATO is doing, and not just in the realm of defense, but for the core functions of NATO, of a defense policy, in terms of deterrence, nuclear and conventional, but also warfighting, territorial warfighting against a major state threat. The CSDP leaves a lot to be desired. Okay. So there's a very long way to go here. And again, the most recent crisis in Ukraine very clearly reveals the gaps in defense capabilities between what the EU can do on its own and what NATO can do. So as we know, NATO has adopted a reassurance strategy to help cope with this problem in most of Northern Europe with 4 new battle groups, and then more recently has done a similar effort in the Black Sea region, again, all aimed at, obviously, Russia. So again, the CSDP really can't hope to do much of this at all, and I'll come back to these points later. So looking now at the security side, the story is a little bit more positive, but again, it has to be qualified. So the security side, and again, we've had to take us back to the 1990s, and it's very relevant that we're having this discussion here in the Balkans, because there would be no CSDP without the situation in the Balkans in the 1990s. So this directly inspired the idea that the European Union itself should have its own capabilities to respond to a crisis like the collapse of Yugoslavia, and to do so without relying so much on the United States and NATO. And again, most of this activity was framed at the time, as you may know, in the form of what's called the Petersburg tasks. Humanitarian and rescue tasks, peacekeeping, peace enforcement, most of which at the time were framed as military tasks. And these found their way into the Amsterdam Treaty 20 years ago, and they're supposed to be a central part of the CSDP, and a central inspiration for it, besides the defense side of it. So again, the question is the EU actually doing any of this? On top of the Petersburg tasks, as you know, in 2003, when the CSDP itself was launched as an operational forum, we had the European Security Strategy, which outlined several specific threats: terrorism, weapons proliferation, regional conflict, state failure, and organized crime. And then in 2008, in a very brief review of the mechanism, it added 3 possible new security threats into the security strategy: energy security, climate change, and then cyber. So basically, between the Petersburg tasks and the security strategy and the review, we have at least 8 roughly central security problems that could be addressed by the CSDP and related EU policy tools. So this should be kind of our main benchmarking in terms of thinking about how well the mechanism is functioning. Finally, more recently, there is now talk, as you know, in the past few years, of a strategic culture for the EU in terms of security policy and the use of military force, and a desire in the new EU global strategy to have strategic autonomy. And again, these are presented as new things, but they did exist at the time during the discussions in the late 1990s when the CSDP was created. So the idea of autonomy from NATO, from the NATO, has always been part of this narrative. The question is, can the EU achieve it? And again, in the security strategy itself, the idea was to have a capability to foster early, rapid, and where necessary, robust intervention, up to and including military force. Okay, so that's the benchmark. So how does it look? It doesn't look very, very good at all. In fact, when you compare the record to what was meant to be achieved in the late 1990s. So again, depending on how you frame this activity, it can look impressive in some fashion, looking at maps and statements of purpose and things like this. But when you kind of look beyond the details and dig a little bit deeper, it's very disappointing, in fact. what the CSDP has achieved overall, okay? So the first point to get out of the way is that most CSDP activities, as you may know, are civilian in nature rather than military. And I'll talk about military in a minute, but most of those military actions, in fact, are not even what you would call Petersburg tasks or intervention or robust intervention. They're very minor activities, and many of them have to do basically with training, with mentoring, monitoring, and so on. So again, you can look at maps like this from the EU website, and it does look impressive, like the EU is all over the place in its periphery, doing all kinds of very interesting, useful things through the CSDP. And again, the record shows roughly 34 actions, and I say around 34 because the EU itself doesn't know whether certain actions qualify as a CSDP operation. Some operations are actually not CSDP, but they put the name on it for political purposes. So that's why I say around 34. But again, it's impressive as a set of activities, and it varies widely across Africa and Europe, and as far away as Indonesia, as you can see here. So it does look impressive, but if we take a closer look at details, it changes. Another general point to keep in mind is maps like this do not show the extremely wide variance in terms of the size of the operations, the funding of the operations, how many mission staff they have, and their impact, and so on. And again, this varies extremely widely. Operations such as Kosovo or the Althea operation in Bosnia, they were extremely large in terms of funding, in terms of personnel. So these are major operations. But many others, they barely qualify as a CSDP action or mission or operation. A handful of staff operating out of an office building in a capital somewhere doing very minor things, okay? So huge and wide range of activity, and as I said earlier, most of it is civilian in nature rather than military, okay? Taking a look at the actual military operations, there have been 6 EU peacekeeping operations that would qualify, I would say, as peacekeeping tasks or Petersburg tasks under the definition I gave you earlier. And so 2 of those tasks were basically takeovers, as you know, from NATO operations, Concordia and Althea, both in the Balkans. And these were operations that were winding down at the time. So NATO was trying to get out, America was trying to get out. So these are not really useful or critical tests of the CSDP capability at the time, although they were very useful as learning activities, as I argue in the book, okay? So useful, but not really independent EU peacekeeping operations. So that brings us to Africa, and there have been 4 entirely independent EU peacekeeping operations, 4 spread across 3 countries, Chad, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Republic of Central Africa. But again, looking at the close details, if you've read anything about these operations, you should know that these are all basically French military operations that are just run under an EU flag. So France was the critical country, not just in terms of supplying the operations and commanding them, but also instigating them and providing the agenda-setting process that led them to be done as CSDP operations rather than something else. On top of that, they were fairly small in nature compared to the Balkans operations, around 2,000 troops, and they were short-term in nature as well, again, compared to the Balkans, where you've had operations running for over a decade. And on top of this, you've had many missed opportunities for similar peacekeeping operations in Africa and elsewhere, and I'll come back to that point later on. So again, overall, if we're going back to the Petersburg tasks, the idea of a robust intervention force that's commanded by the EU to solve security problems, there's no political will for this, really. So the idea of giving the EU this mandate is really wishful thinking, I would argue. And in fact, if the EU hopes to do anything like this in the future, it basically should delegate to the member states to run peacekeeping operations that require offensive military force, as France is doing currently still in Northern Africa. So again, the EU has tried. It's launched these operations. It created even a new mechanism, the EU battle groups, specifically for the purpose of launching these types of operations after the learning experience of what happened in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And yet it's failed multiple occasions to deploy these battle groups for operational purposes. even though it's precisely what it was created for. So again, the EU tried to plan with these things, and it's failed on multiple occasions. So again, I would argue that the idea of the EU itself as a robust peacekeeping force has a long way to go, just like with defense policy. So here's a summary of most of the CSDP actions taken between 2003 and 2016. And again, if you're looking only at the mandates of the operations, what they're supposed to do, you can see, maybe a third or a little bit more have completed their mandates in a satisfactory fashion. So that's, I guess, the good news. But again, many others are either ongoing or had a very limited completion of the mandate, and some others at the bottom were completely useless, either because they weren't launched, or because they did not complete the mandate, or because the political conditions in the countries did not allow the mandate to be completed. Okay? But a bigger point on top of this fact is that the Commission could have done a lot of this activity. Okay? That fourth column, non-executive civilian missions, that's Commission territory for the most part. So these didn't need to be CSDP operations. It didn't need to go through the headaches of intergovernmental discussions, of consensus building, and all these delays and difficulties of funding and so forth. The Commission could have done it. And in fact, the Commission has done some of these operations. It was delegated to do so. And in some cases, it was running its own operations simultaneously with CSDP operations. So again, why so much redundancy? Why the insistence on having the member states do it when the Commission or an EU special representative could have done this? Again, because most of this activity is civilian, okay? It's not military, it's not executive. That's Commission territory. I'll come back to that point later on as well, okay? So again, looking at again, various types of capabilities from practice over the past 12 years, and again, these are the independent actions, not takeover missions. You can see that France is the central, critical, indispensable country behind EU military peacekeeping operations. Without France, there would have been no military peacekeeping, those 4 operations in Africa. But besides France, you can see, depending on the various type of operation, other countries have stepped up. Germany has been critical in every mission except military peacekeeping. I mean, it has contributed to peacekeeping operations, but as a critical, indispensable nation, it's not the case. It's been very supportive of police and military maritime operations, as well as some other civilian actions, security sector reform, rule of law, and so forth. So again, this has functioned to some degree, but is it really fair to rely so much on France for peacekeeping and a handful of other member states to take most of the burden where these operations are concerned, when you have, again, up to 28 member states that could be involved? Okay, so again, critical mass of some countries doing this, but not enough to make it purely European. Most actions have been understaffed, and most have been under-resourced, at least in the initial startup phases of these activities. Okay, and again, this is despite more than 10 years of practice under the CSDP. Okay, so let's turn now to some ambitions based on the actual record of the system since 2009. That's my theme music playing, I guess. So Lisbon. Now, the EU did recognize that the system wasn't functioning. So, to its credit, the Lisbon Treaty process, 2008-2009, did attempt to improve the mechanism, to improve the system, and again, not just the CSDP, as you know, but to improve the entire way that the EU thinks about security and defense policy and crisis response. But at the same time, it is still largely an intergovernmental approach to these topics and these problems. So consensus, intergovernmental consensus, is still largely the rule for most CSDP actions. Obviously, ones that involve a military component do require consensus. But beyond that problem is the fact that the system is still too unwieldy and too complicated and too fragmented to allow it to function as a single crisis manager or crisis response mechanism. And again, despite years and years of practice, of institutional change, of institutional reform, and operational experience. So again, the EU has tried and has expanded and has improved in some ways, and I do talk about that in the book, but you have to look at the entire picture. And the fact of the matter is there are still serious problems in light of what the EU is trying to achieve, and especially the security challenges that are currently facing Europe at large. And again, a lot of this can be boiled down to one specific problem, and that is leadership. The system does not have a very coherent and consistent and authoritative source of leadership in the realm of security and defense and crisis management. And as long as that is the case, it's going to be playing catch-up and putting out fires after they've already broken out, and reacting rather than being proactive and being strategic, which again is another critical goal here. So again, I know you probably can't see this from the slide, but I'm using a very technical term here in political science, a complete mess, because that's exactly what it is. And again, this is after Lisbon rationalized it and improved it and enhanced it, okay? So again, if a crisis breaks out, a security crisis requiring quick action, you know, who's in charge? Who has the dossier? Who's supposed to do something? Who is supposed to set the agenda? Well, you know, your guess is as good as mine, because it depends entirely on the political circumstances of that particular crisis. And again, that's not the way to create a strategic, robust actor, especially in dealing with very, very high risk, high danger situations requiring possible military intervention or police forces, okay? So again, multiple actors playing at crisis management here. Some are located in the European External Action Service, which again was also created to streamline, to improve, to enhance crisis response. But also the Council and then especially the European Commission have retained their own and expanded, especially the Commission has expanded its own crisis response mechanisms, partly to compete with what the European External Action Service is doing. Okay, so rather than rationalize the system and streamline it and enhance it and make it clear and more effective, I would argue that the Lisbon system actually is a step backwards, at least one step backwards. I think it's made the situation far worse than it was before 2009. And there are many other reasons for this that I go into detail in the book about. Okay, but to summarize, the big missing problem in Lisbon, the big missed opportunity, was to bring together security policy and development policy in a single institution with a single chain of command, a single leadership. And again, it could have been done in the Commission, it could have been done in the European External Action Service, but what did they do? They separated and institutionalized those two critical domains, security and security in the External Action Service, and then development and humanitarian aid, again, the Commission. And this has exacerbated problems of coordination and problems of coherence rather than solving them as Lisbon was supposed to do. So again, this is the central missed opportunity. Until this problem is solved, I would argue the EU will always be incoherent as a crisis manager and crisis responder. Again, the problem can be solved, it can be changed, but at the moment there's very little political will to actually do that, to bring these two things together in a single institution. So again, when the European External Action Service was created, there was talk that they would have the development mandate and possibly the enlargement mandate, while the Commission would retain trade policy and possibly humanitarian aid policy. But by separating these two things and taking them away from the External Action Service and putting them back in the Commission, you just made the situation worse. Okay? So you have bureaucratic politics operating here. Okay? So again, here's another way to look at this in terms of the big institutions. You can see the European External Action Service. It has its own, crisis platform and a small intelligence capability that's supposed to monitor activities and propose actions where it can have an action. But again, the European Commission on the left here, that entire box pretty much, is still a very huge policy domain. It has a lot of money to spend, it has a lot of authority, a lot of political clout, and a lot of experience, by the way. Let's not forget, the Commission has decades of experience as a humanitarian and development aid actor, helping prepare countries for enlargement, and so forth, where the EEAS has very limited experience. So again, if there's one institution that should be responsible for civilian crisis management, crisis response, and linking security to development, it should be the Commission, okay? The External Action Service under this system is superfluous, okay? I don't know what the purpose of it is under this current arrangement, okay? So again, we'll come back to this point in a few minutes as well, okay? So to summarize, even though the EU recognized problems in 2008, 2009, even though the EU had a clear window of opportunity to do something and made some major changes in terms of new institutions, the External Action Service and so forth, it didn't work, okay? It did not work. And in fact, as I said, it can be seen as a step backwards. In fact, you could say that it even made the situation worse after 2009 for several years relative to what was going on after 2003, 2004. And again, how do we know this? Well, you can look at the CSDP, you can look at crisis management activity after Lisbon, after the EEAS was created, and you can see that for several years, the system went into hibernation. I mean, complete hibernation relative to what happened after 2003 and 2004. So for several years after 2009, the CSDP was missing in action, okay? And of course, that's not for lack of opportunities for doing something, because also after 2009, as you know, much of the periphery of the European Union was erupting in constant crisis, constant turmoil and problems, and yet the CSDP in particular was never used as a tool for dealing with many of those problems. Although, again, they discussed it, and they did launch some minor, training or mentoring operations, okay? So when was the peak innovation of the CSDP? When was it really dynamic and creative and interesting and important? Well, it was 2005, okay? So again, looking at the entire history of the mechanism, 2005 was the peak year of activity in terms of launching new operations and innovating, okay, doing new things, learning and creating new institutions to solve specific problems of various parts of the world. And again, not just in Europe, but in Africa and as far away as Indonesia, as I said. So 2005 was the peak. 13 operations either launched or already underway. And again, today there's about 16 operations underway, but as I said earlier, almost all of these, the vast majority, were launched years and years ago. So these are just basically continuing operations rather than new ones, okay? So again, 2005 was the peak. It starts to go down a little bit. After 2008, 2009, it's on autopilot or hibernation. Again, a massive missed opportunity right after the system was reformed to improve this mechanism and to improve EU foreign security policy and crisis response, okay? So it didn't work. Again, look at this list. You did not need the External Action Service to do any of this stuff, okay? So you had all this innovation going on between 2003 and 2008, no External Action Service, right? And most of the activity is focused in the Commission and the Council Secretariat General, okay? So they were doing a good job before Lisbon came along and helped mess it all up. And again, Lisbon is not the only thing at stake here, of course. You had the 2008 financial crisis and many other factors going on. And you can expect a couple of years of institutional, growing pains after 2010 and 2011. But certainly by 2012, 13, 14, you would hope that the system would recover and start doing more. But again, we certainly do not see that, all right? And again, the EU does recognize this, okay? So I'm not the only one making these claims. So various actors within the EU system, within EU member states, have called for reinvigorating, reforming the mechanism, reinvigorating permanent structured cooperation, some form of military planning and conduct capability, similar to what the EU does in civilian realm, a new intervention force, even though it already has battle groups, which was created as an intervention force, a military Schengen arrangement to promote pooling and sharing and defense procurement across the EU. So these are good, these are steps in the right direction, I guess. But they don't address the core central problem in the realm of security in the realm of crisis response. And again, that's the lack of consistent strategic leadership at the EU political level. All right? So again, there's a summary here of what is being proposed. And I would argue most of these things are likely to happen in some form, mainly because they are modest reforms and mainly because they build on what the EU is already doing. Okay? So there are frameworks that already exist to facilitate all of these activities. So the EU, it's modest, progressive reform rather than fundamental reform of the type that I've said is necessary. So again, for a common security and defense policy, what you need is common planning, common resourcing, common training, commanding, and deploying on a consistent basis from a consistent authority at the EU political level, rather than the rotating presidency mechanism, or rather than having the high representative come in and try to convince the EU member states to do something, which also is not happening very, very much either. And then possibly some type of EU Security Defense Council, as some people have argued. I would agree with this statement, again, at the political strategic level, not down at the level of the Commission or lower. So again, the Political and Security Committee is useful for planning operations once they've been agreed, or working out the details, but not for the big strategic planning that, say, a European Council of Defense Ministers would do if it could meet on a regular basis. So this has to be dealt with in some fashion. And again, there are different models we could adopt, but at present, the EU does not have it. Okay, so these are marginal, incremental reforms that might make some difference in terms of procurement and so on, but in terms of making the EU more credible, more responsible, more effective, more powerful, it leaves a lot to be desired, and I don't see much happening in that realm. Okay, all right. Just to sum up, kind of the current situation where we are and what the EU could be doing. This talk has been very negative, as you know. Basically, when I speak to American audiences, I have to be very positive, and I have to sell the EU and how great it is and how much it does. But when I speak to European audiences, I have to be honest, because the challenges are great, and the EU is not meeting the challenges. So I want to be clear that in the book, you have to buy the book. The book has the good stuff. The book has a lot of positive information about what good the EU has done in the world. Okay, so I would like to stress very much the EU, and not only has value added as a security manager or crisis responder, it has a very unique value added. It can do things that no other actor in the world can do in terms of multilateral cooperation, using a wide range of policy tools, from diplomacy and good offices to economic aid, humanitarian aid, development aid, humanitarian aid, sanctions, police missions, rule of law missions, security sector reform, military police peacekeeping, and then naval and maritime security operations. So no other actor, in terms of a regional player, can really do this wide range of things. Again, the United States claims to do a lot of this, but it overwhelmingly favors military force, as you probably know. So the EU does have its own unique toolkit that it can deploy, and has deployed for positive purposes, but it needs to push it a lot further to cope with what is going on in the world today. And again, part of that value added, that selling point that the EU has, is that link between security and development. And that is the great irony of Lisbon, is rather than bring those things together under a single roof for a single purpose, right? It separated and institutionalized the division, and we're still coping with it to this day. Because, bear in mind, most of the security problems that the EU has to deal with on the periphery are in developing countries, right? So security and development have to go together for most of what the EU does in its bordering regions. So to separate these two things into two different institutions with their own different capabilities and organizational goals is a massive mistake and missed opportunity that has to be rectified if the EU is hoping to achieve this holy grail of the comprehensive approach, or now what it's called, the integrated approach. Okay, you've got to bring those things together. And on top of that, I think it has to lead by example. It has to live up to its own norms, because again, also like the United States, the EU claims to be a normative power, an ethical power, a moral power to promote not just the development in humanitarian rights, but democracy and other factors, rule of law, and so forth. So if the EU is not living up to and defending these principles internally and possibly in its bordering regions, it is going to suffer a credibility crisis, a legitimacy crisis. And I think that is already happening today. And I think you can see it with some of the political debates that are going on across the EU now, not the least of which is the Brexit process, okay, of criticizing the EU for failing to live up to its own standards. So again, lead by example and bring these two critical components together of security and aid. And again, the EU is very innovative in this internal security realm. It does a lot in terms of organized crime and counterterror capabilities and policing and so forth. It does things that the United States is incapable of in terms of international law enforcement, okay? So why can't it take that creativity and dynamism and innovation and transfer it or link it to the external realm by bringing security and development and humanitarian aid together in a single body, okay? So again, getting back to the good news, I guess, is EU now for Somalia, the counter-piracy operation. In my view, that's the single most important CSDP operation in terms of living up to the original inspiration for the CSDP as a tool to solve specific European security problems, okay? So again, piracy off the coast of Somalia has been almost completely eradicated within the scope of 3 or 4 years, okay? And that is a remarkable achievement by a regional economic organization like the European Union. Now, obviously, they've had help from other institutions, including NATO and the UN, but the EU took the lead on this and organized the main activities that were responsible for protecting these shipments, and also took the lead in terms of incarcerating and putting in the pirates, which is something that NATO cannot do. And again, this is a remarkable capability that the EU alone possesses relative to other international actors. So NATO actually had to give up its captured pirates to the EU for possible trial and incarceration in Africa, okay? Again, that's the integrated approach in action, the comprehensive approach, linking the military side to the civilian and diplomatic side of things and rule of law capabilities. So again, if you could map the comprehensive approach, the integrated approach as I would see it, this is what it would look like. You'd have short-term goals, and then you would have long-term goals to kind of facilitate long-term change. You would have different types of strategic efforts at risk, so functional, the maritime security strategy, geographic documents, and then institutional, the creation of the EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa. On top of that, you would have a range of policy tools that you would deploy to deal with the problem. So you see 3 specific CSDP operations, as well as 2 EU civilian capacity building arrangements. You would have funding from a wide range of sources, member states, the European Union, Instrument for Stability, European Development Funding. And on top of all that, you would have multiple partners. So the EU would play the central coordinating role among a range of actors who have similar interests in dealing with the problem. And here the EU coordinated with the United Nations, with the African Union, with NATO, with the International Maritime Organization, International Maritime Bureau, shipping organizations, and private shipping firms, okay? So this is a massive, massive coordination effort involving multiple actors, multiple problems, and it worked, okay? It totally worked in this case. And I'm not, obviously piracy hasn't disappeared completely, but relative, again, to the situation in 2009 and 2010, it's dramatically been reduced. And again, this has a lot to do with what the EU did using this integrated approach. So again, the EU is capable, it can do it. Why isn't it doing it? Okay. Also good news, consistently, okay, for almost 20 years, most Europeans consistently support European cooperation in security and defense. And we're not talking about 51%. We're talking about the vast majority, up to 75% across the EU, And again, in some countries it is extremely high, 70 and 80% of Europeans supporting a common security defense policy. So European citizens actually want this. They want the EU to be doing a lot of this activity, but the EU is failing it, okay? The bad news, as I said before, the EU has to lead by example, okay? In terms of rule of law, human rights, democratic norms, everything it supposedly lives for. But you can see among the EU's own member states, I'm sure we're all aware of this, several EU states are having serious problems with rule of law, with democracy, freedom of the press, and other problems. On top of this, of course, you have Brexit, the UK committing suicide, of course, by leaving the European Union for various reasons. So again, between Brexit and between the problems in these Eastern European countries, the EU has to also get its own house in order at the same time it's dealing with these problems. And there's another recent poll on the right. You can see some countries, the citizens are very upset. You know, 2/3 of people in Greece polled would say they would join a large-scale uprising against their government. Okay, does that suggest that the EU is on the right track? You know, that the EU and its member states are doing good in the world. Okay, so again, external power is contingent on internal cohesion and power, and the EU has to deal with this problem at the same time of dealing with other ones. Okay, again, the second military action in the maritime realm is the military action against human trafficking. It took over 2 years to arrange this, far too long. Too many people were killed, and it had a very detrimental effect on the EU's normative or ethical power. Okay, it should not have taken over 2 years to organize this operation. But again, in the end, the EU did do it, and it is trying to save lives on the Mediterranean. So again, beyond the security development nexus, I think, and the internal factors, the critical gap here is the EU's neighborhood. Okay, this is where the vast majority of EU efforts have to be focused in terms of international security, not global power or global activeness, but on its own neighborhood. Okay, and again, just off the top of my head, here are some examples of things the EU could be doing in various parts of the world, neighborhood and beyond, through the CSDP and other mechanisms. Again, thinking about regional security, crisis response, and yet the EU is doing actually very little of this. Okay, the counter-piracy operation and the maritime security operation in the Med have dealt with some of these issues, but they are the exceptions to the rule. Okay, there are very few other operations that deal, you know, with any of these things. All right, so there are many, many opportunities, windows of opportunity for the EU to do something, anything, to deal with some of these problems through the CSDP mechanism. And in doing so, again, the EU has to bring its own value added, its own stamp onto the situation. And in my view, that's 3 ways: linking security and development in a coherent way, linking civilian and military capabilities in a strategic way, and then bringing in public and private or state and non-state actors into the realm in the way they did very much in the counter-piracy operation, which again was extremely successful. Okay, so again, the EU is still innovating; it's still important. The European Medical Corps, I think, is a very useful idea, a very important possibility in terms of another outbreak of Ebola or something like this in Africa. So this is a great idea. It's just not being done through the CSDP, of course. But remember, you know, if you're putting aid workers at risk in Africa and other places, you know, those people have to be protected. Okay, so would the CSDP launch an operation to secure or to protect or to evacuate medical corps workers who were sent by the EU? So again, this is just one possible, you know, area of opportunity or potential mission that the CSDP has to plan for in light of the creation of this previous mechanism, the new European Medical Corps. So again, that's just one example, but you see this whole list of possibilities here: demining operations, demobilization, mediation, arbitration, energy security, and so forth. CSDP has done very little of any of this stuff, okay? But the possibility is there, all right? And again, regional failure. Decades of close involvement in North Africa and the Mediterranean. After the Arab Spring, the EU CSDP locks down. It doesn't do anything that's extremely or very effective in dealing with any of these problems. Again, we had the Libya possible operation, but that was never launched at the time. So a range of, again, possibilities, but no major CSDP actions, even though we had created the European External Action Service. And again, people are saying how difficult Libya and Syria are, and yes, they're difficult, but what about a total collapse of Egypt, okay, on the range of what Syria has experienced? 80 million people in Egypt, right? So if you think Syria is bad with 20 million people, what happens if Egypt goes the same way at some point? Or Saudi Arabia with 30 million people, or Iran, or Turkey, you know, or Russia, okay? And these are all within the realm of possibility within the next generation, if not sooner, okay? So these are the things the EU has to be planning for. So Libya and Syria were not crises. They were problems, they were challenges, the crises in those countries, but they weren't crises for the EU, okay? A crisis for the EU is 10 million refugees spilling over from Turkey or Russia into the EU. Most refugees from Syria are still in the Middle East, right? They didn't go to Europe, okay? So it's not a European crisis. But again, within those countries, it's terrible, okay? So Middle East and North Africa completely on fire, and the EU is not doing anything effective to cope with it other than now saving some refugees in the Mediterranean, okay? So there's no global actorness, there's no global strategic autonomy if the EU cannot secure its own flanks. And again, these terms, resilience, capacity building, in the grand strategy, the global strategy, okay, in the long term, in the short term, they're not going to help. They're not going to replace robust strategic intervention, all right? And again, this is not just my analysis. If you ask other experts, the European Council on Foreign Relations, there's the scorecard on the worst EU policies, foreign policy, and look, it's at the top of the list, right? Its own flank for 20 years of activity, and yet it gets a D+, okay? And then the response to the immigration crisis, number 2, okay? So this is not just me. This is any reasonable policy expert, I think, who looks at these challenges would have to say that the EU has not measured up, despite, you know, 18 years, 17 years of activity with the CSDP, okay? And those are only the worst 2. I mean, below that, you see many other crises as well, Sudan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and so forth, okay? But the worst one, top of the list, is the Mediterranean and North Africa. That has got to be the priority for most of what the EU does in the realm of security and crisis response. Here's a survey of European citizens asking the same question. Has the EU responded well? The far right column is the total who agree, and you can see in Great Britain, 25% actually agree, which is kind of remarkable. But in many other countries polled, it's extremely low, you know, 10%, 15% agree. So European citizens, they want the CSDP to work, they're watching it, and they know that it's not functioning, okay? So the EU is not living up to its responsibilities, and its own citizens know this. They are now paying attention to this. I think before 2009, they weren't paying so much attention, but after the Arab Spring in particular, and then Russia's invasion of Crimea, annexation, now Europe is paying a lot more attention, and they're not happy, okay? Final points, 4 major institutional reforms. Just to recap, Berlin Plus, battle groups, the role of the High Representative Vice President, and the European External Action Service did not work as designed, okay? And these are major reforms to try to improve the mechanism, and not one of them, I think, has worked in the way it was designed. Again, and the details are in the book. But they were defeated by intergovernmental politics and bureaucratic. So the EU has to reform itself and change all of this. And if it's going to rely on member states to lead, again, a big hole in the process is Germany, okay? Germany is the missing link, okay? France is willing to put up military force when necessary. Germany, much less so. And again, this is because of domestic political opposition, okay? So again, using force to defeat terrorism, people in Germany, a majority, say no, we shouldn't not rely too much on force. But the more important one is the chart on the right. How few Germans say that we should defend allies against a Russian attack, okay? So again, this is why defense within the EU has to be built through NATO rather than through the CSDP. requiring outside support, okay? And again, I'm not the only one saying this. There are many other studies of this and stories about of Germany not leading in the way it should be, okay? So again, consolidate security policy as a unique policy domain, work with NATO in the realm of defense and cyber, and bring together CSDP. I would also just like to throw out there that Trump, you know, we all hope he goes away, at least I do, sooner rather than later, but Trump is not, he's not the cause of of America's problems. He's a symptom, okay? So even if he disappears, there could be worse American presidents waiting behind him, okay, such as Mike Pence, in fact, okay? So even if Trump is impeached or goes away in 3 years, hopefully, what he represents will not go away, okay? And it's no accident that someone like Trump followed like someone like Obama, if you know anything about American racial politics. So what he is a symptom of American problems, not the cause of these problems, okay? So again, the world is on fire, protests rising, grievances. America's not leading, global governance is not delivering, so the EU has a major window, here, okay? And again, I'm not the only one saying, even Americans are saying that Europe is looking pretty good now, okay? We prefer Europe rather than what's going on in the United States, and I do as well, which is why I live in Europe. So again, I put my money where my mouth is, but again, that doesn't mean the EU is doing well. So just to summarize, last slide. Remember Jean Monnet, this is what opens my book. Europe will be forged in crises and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises. So it's facing crises internally, externally, it's working on the solutions, but this approach is not going to be effective in the long term, okay, in dealing with a major problem like a collapse of Russia or Turkey or something like that. So the EU's got to be strategic, and remember, it was created as a peace project, first of all, as a security community, and yet it's been distracted by economic problems as well as enlargement, okay? It has to get back to its core and retain security for its own people if it hopes to survive, okay? And I'm out of time, so thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope you learned a few things and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.